You are listening to the Airline Selection Podcast, where we bring you insights to help you succeed at airline selections. This podcast is brought to you by Airline Selection Program. Please welcome your host, airline captain and major airline recruiter, Guillaume Deboucher.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Airline Selection Podcast, where we bring you tips and insights to help you succeed at airline selections. Today we have Calvin Shields with us with a new episode. How are you doing, Calvin, today?
I'm great, Guillaume, thanks.
Excellent. So what are we going to discuss in this episode, Calvin?
Well, the last time and the last podcast, we were talking about the VC10 simulator, and I must say that we were talking about events of more than 50 years ago, and a bit of the information was a bit hazy. So I did a little bit of research to try and remind myself and refresh my memory as to exactly what the simulators were like. Well, BOAC had two Redifon VC10 simulators based at Cranebank, which is the training center of British Airways, which I believe still exists. Actually, that's not true. I believe I've seen that the Cranebank has been demolished, rather.
I heard so. I couldn't believe it. You know how we used to call it? It was Braincrank, because you had to think a lot when you were there. You knew you were up for a lot of work. So we're going to talk about the VC10s, and you wanted to talk about something else, I think.
Oh, I see. Yes, we'll talk about the VC10 simulators to start with, and then very briefly, you asked the questions about the introduction of the various types of 747 with B8. So I thought I would give you the accurate answers to that. And then I thought we'd end up with base training on the aircraft versus a simulator right at the end.
Excellent. And maybe when we talk about the 74, since there were large differences between the 100 and the 400, maybe we can continue to talk about the state of the technology and how it got introduced on the airplane and what it changed. If you would like. Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay. Sweet.
So
over to you with the VC10 then, the VC10 simulator.
Okay, going back to the VC10 simulators made by Redifon, and they were based in Cranebank, but they only had a single axis hydraulic motion system. So it wasn't a fixed base, but all it could do is effectively move in pitch. So as I'm sure you can imagine, that's actually really quite limiting in terms of simulator reality. They also required a training captain to operate it, plus a radio operator who had to set up all of the radio aids as the detail was progressing, and a training flight engineer, because we, of course, also had flight engineers at the time. And the track, it was quite amusing, was actually plotted on a piece of glass with a perspex backing to it. It was actually inked on with a pen, like a moving pen that moved on the glass, so you could see your track after you finished your detail. But the bit that has always amused me, was the visual system, which I did talk about. It was a camera, as I've mentioned, which could react to inputs from the pilots, from roll pitch, and the actual camera moved over the scale model, but it was much bigger than I remember. The actual size of the model, which was mounted vertically on a wall, was 80 feet by 20 feet. What's that? That's about, it's quite large, put it that way. The camera also I was trying to think of a metric conversion then, and I couldn't, but it's a lot.
25 meters by 25 meters by it's big.
25 meters exactly. But the camera required very bright lights, because to get a good depth of field for the lenses, the lens technology in those days wasn't as good as it is now. So they had to have very, very bright lights. And the problem is, I mentioned previously about some of the problems, but of course there was always a really big issue that it might actually catch fire at any time, of course. But there was only one model which was shared by both sims. So if both sims were being used, only one simulator could use the model. So it required timing between the two instructors to make sure you both weren't trying to use the model at the same time. But the bit that really interests me, compared to today, when we know everything is digital and miniaturized, to control all of the motions and everything else of the simulator, they had to have analog computers, which of course pre-digital. These behemoths were huge, and they were the one for each simulator, and they were housed in a room that was 50 feet long, and they were controlled by valves and switches and mechanical devices. So It was really very, very basic indeed. But
So the
it
computer
wasn't
itself was 50 feet long, because today when you go to a simulator bay, behind the simulators, you see very big rooms with still lots of computer and motherboards everywhere. So this wouldn't seem that much different from today. But what you're saying is that the actual computer, the box itself, was 50 feet long.
correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
On a modern simulator, on a 3-axis modern simulator, that would probably be just the width of the simulator by about maybe not even a meter. So we're
Right.
looking at the floor area of completely different dimensions. You also asked about mechanical or at least training devices. We used to have these mechanical system trainers as well in Cranebank, which were quite big, mechanical, slightly electric. And when I say slightly, they won't always work for systems such as electrics, hydraulics, instruments, panels, and so on. So it was all, compared with today, no computers anywhere, of course, in the offices or anywhere. There were no such thing as computers. Only governments and the military had large computers. And of course, there was a sort of computer for the simulator, but computers just did not exist as far as the everyday man was concerned. So it reminds me very much how different it was in those days, how very mechanical and basic it was.
So those trainers for these models you were talking about now outside of the simulator, you mean you had some panels that were electrically powered that could put some lights on and you can action some switches so you could rehearse your procedures? Is that what we are talking about?
Exactly. I did look up on the internet and also looked at Pathé News, which is a good source of old films. These things were really very, very big and they were large and very difficult to manage and difficult to operate, but they were mechanical. If you pulled a lever, something happened, or you pushed a switch, a light would come on in sequence. Very similar to, I guess, a computer version of that today, where you touch a screen and it all happens.
Or today it's often called an IPT, instrument or instructing procedural trainer, where basically you arrive and there's some of it is just cardboard with a picture of the plane, and some switches are actionable, or there's indeed some computerized, a computer where you actually press on virtual switches essentially. So it's, at the end of the day, you had to learn the procedures.
Yeah, the concept was the same then.
The concept is the same, yeah.
But it was just very mechanical rather than being nicely on a computer.
And how did the plane feel? How did the VC10 plane feel compared to when you actually then went to fly it?
The simulator was very basic, and to be honest, it wasn't very realistic at all. There was a lot of lag when you're trying to fly the visual, of course, because it was a mechanical device. The computers, the analog computers, did their best to try and make it as realistic, but it wasn't. I feel that it was more of a procedure trainer than actually being able to teach you to fly the aeroplane. But of course, as ever, we had to go and fly the aeroplane before we were allowed to fly passengers. So at that particular point, we learned to fly the airplane properly. And I must admit, it was a fantastic aeroplane to fly. There were no engines on the wings, and therefore the 4 engines were on the tail. Therefore, there was the wing was very clean. It was very responsive. It was designed initially to operate in hot and high airfields, such as, well, the East Coast or east of Africa, which is very high. A lot of the airports we'd go to are at 5,000 feet. So it was designed for that. It was very nice. And one thing I can say is that when you got close to the ground, because there were no engines on the wing, the ground effect was like landing on a cushion. It was very easy to land.
Yeah, it's interesting. The ground effect is, that could be a whole. We could do a whole episode on the ground effect, the positives and the negatives, and what to do when it's hot and high, because now you don't have as much. And it's an interesting one. I personally like the idea, like an airplane that has a nice ground effect. The 777 was certainly like that, because it just helps your landing. But of course, when the air is thinner, now you've got to flare a little bit earlier. So in the sim, could you trim?
Yes, you could. Yes, you would have trim in all 3 axes. Yeah, we used rudder trim or engine failures. Yes, of course you could. You had to, but it was not very good.
Okay. So the first time you actually discovered the VC10 itself was during your base training?
No. Of course, we had to do the type technical, the theory, which was very, very demanding, as I've already mentioned.
Yeah.
Then, of course, we'd go on to the procedure trainers, the bits we just talked about, and then, of course, you would do a certain number of sessions in the simulator. I can't remember how many. On a 7.4, it was normally 11 4-hour sessions, so it must have been similar, I guess, where you learn roughly what the aeroplane was like. And then, as I mentioned in the previous podcast, we then went to Shannon, where we flew an aeroplane over a period of 2 weeks to cover all of the license.
That's right.
So by the time we left Shannon, we had, I can't remember how many landings on lot. I'm thinking maybe 15 landings. So at that particular point, we'd then joined BOAC. I would be a second officer. And that means that I had limits on what weather I could operate in. I could only fly with the training captain for a certain number of hours, and so on, which is very similar to what airlines do today.
But when would you do your base training then? Because so you did your theory, then you worked in the procedural trainer, then you worked in the sim, then you went to Shannon for 2 weeks.
Yeah,
You did
Shannon
some flying and some base training, right? So which one came first?
Well, during that 2 weeks, it was to qualify, to have all of the certify, if you like, that we'd completed all of the requirements for the conversion. But on top of that, we'd do base training as well.
So it was kind of embedded.
Absolutely. That's why it was 2 weeks. It was a long period of time where we flew out of those 2 weeks, certainly 10 days.
So I assume that on the first sessions of that, the training captain would take off. They would take you to a maneuvering area where you would then get to know the plane, and gradually you would fly it more and more. You would take it off probably quite soon. And then when he was comfortable, he would let you land it. And then at the end, you do a lot more handling, I assume.
Yeah, that's correct. The very first detail was learning how to taxi it. Because it was obviously a lot bigger than I think a Baron B-55 was the aeroplane that I finished with at Hamble. So you learn how to taxi it, and you learn how to appreciate the different speed size of the aeroplane. And then, of course, you take it off first time. You take it off. I don't think, if I remember rightly, the training captain even did the first takeoff. I'm pretty sure that I did straight away.
But then he probably landed it the first one, though.
Yes.
Yeah, to show you the flare height and stuff. And
yeah, exactly. The whole situation was such that it was a gradual process where we learnt how to handle the aeroplane. We then went out over the Atlantic and did the maneuvers which were required for the license, during which time we would do engine failures after a certain number of sessions in the aeroplane, simulated with throttling the engine back. 3 engine go-rounds and that sort of thing we would do. And at the same time, we would sign off the necessary items over the Atlantic with high altitude work.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, today your type ratings are 8 on. So this is interesting because the theory and I guess the procedural training is pretty much the same. You need to learn the plane. And machines of that type are complex, whichever way you look at it. The VC10 was complex, I'm sure, and an Airbus 320 or 777 or 747 is complex. So you've got to do your time in theory and on procedural training just the same, or almost, I assume. And then after that, though, it was much longer in those days, because today you need to do 32 hours, I think, in a Cat D sim before you do your LST, and the 9th detail being the LST, so that's 9. And then after that, you're pretty much good to go. You may do an LVO sim to have the ability to operate in low visibility procedures. And then that's it, that's 10. And if it's your first type rating, your first CS25 type rating, then you'll do your base training on the real airplane. If it's like for myself, if I was now going to do a new type rating, well, because I've got previous experience, I don't need to do the circuit. So I would do one more detail, which would be the ZFTT, the zero flight time training. So it's condensed. So typically, those extra 2 weeks that you got, they're not there anymore.
Yeah, that's interesting, because on the VC10, we had to learn every single nut and bolt on the type technical exam. But when I went to the 747, it was much more a need-to-know basis. So the actual technical side of it and the technical exams were immensely more difficult on the VC10 than on the 747. You probably don't appreciate this. We had to learn the checklist, every item on the checklist.
That's interesting, because we'll talk about CRM, I think, in detail in the next episode. It's true that from what I heard from yourself and from others who flew machines from the previous generation, a lot of emphasis was put on systems knowledge. when I arrived at, and I think British Airways, when I did my 777 type rating, was quite hot on that. The tech exam was quite hard, actually. But after that, they would sort of leave you alone with this. And when I joined Emirates, they went like, there's some things we don't actually need you to know and attempt to learn or double guess, because these machines have a logic. And if you try and double guess what it's doing, it's going to be counterproductive. Yes, we want you to know a lot, but we want you to know a lot where we need you to know a lot. We don't need you to try and understand what's in the engineering bay, which I guess on the VC10 for you, you had to know, like you said, every nut and bolt.
Absolutely. We also had to know all of the limitations.
There
weren't many green and red lines on the instrument to tell you were approaching. You actually had to know the numbers. It was crazy when I look back on it. And as I say, you had to know all of the major, emergency checklist items by memory. Every single checklist was a memory item.
Yeah, because when you mentioned limitations, I remember at the beginning of the FCOM, the 777 FCOM, there are limitations, but there's 2 pages, which there's not that many things. And also there's lots of them with asterisks, which you must know, and others that you should know. There's a difference between the two. And the list is not very long because, as you say, the EGT limit is shown on the screen. This is typically the sort of thing that would be on a multiple choice questionnaire, but they don't expect you to know. It's nice if you know it. You shouldn't base any of your decisions on it. The indication is red or it's not, basically, because there's multiple factors. The line can vary depending on altitude and many other things that they don't want you to start to double guess too many things. But yeah, it's interesting also that you had to memorize all the checklists, because certainly today it's not the idea at all. And in fact, it would be counterproductive. And I remember one day, actually, I was actually at BA. That's an interesting one from a CRM perspective, actually. And I was flying with an ex-Navy pilot, very nice guy. He looked like Tom Selleck, I remember. He was this big mustache, a very nice guy. And we were taxiing, and the first sector we did. And I asked him for the before takeoff checklist. So before takeoff checklist had 1 or 2 items. It wasn't very much. And he didn't put it on the 320. You had to put it on a plastic card and read it. And he did it by memory. And I said, would you mind please reading it? He said, I think I can remember 2 items. I said, I'm sure you can, but I'd like to see you do it the way that, he said, well, just get on with it. We're going to get our takeoff clearance. I said, maybe we do, but I'd like you to read your checklist. And it was bad atmosphere from here on. So he wouldn't do it. So I put the brakes on. I pulled the checklist on my side. I read the checklist. And I said, all right, let's go, and try to make the day work. And it was a tough 4 days with him. And it was an interesting CRM exercise. The first sector was awful. And on that night, we had a layover. He said, okay, let's go out to a bar and have a chat. And, he told me about the Navy, his career and stuff. And he was sorry about it. And we became great friends. Very friendly until the end. And he said, yeah, I'm sorry I put you in this situation, but I think I can remember a checklist. I'm like, the thing is, it's not designed to be by memory. So, anyway, I don't want to go on too long with this now. Do you have anything else you wanted to add on the VC10, or should we move on to the 747 maybe?
No, other than it was a wonderful aeroplane and I was very privileged to be able to fly it, but the 747 is far better.
Yeah, which one flies the nicest out of all the ones that you've flown?
Well, to be honest, Guillaume, I've only ever flown 2 aeroplanes, the VC10 and the 74. And the 747 was just unbelievable to fly. It was like a big light aeroplane, very responsive. You basically, of course, had to consider the inertia of the aeroplane. If you're landing at 310 tons and you're going 180 knots, a half mv squared is an awful lot of energy. But apart from that, it was very responsive. I could land the thing on a 6-month, literally on a centime, I could land it. I knew exactly where the ground was, very responsive. It did have a very nice ground effect, which helped you flare and land it as well. But you had to anticipate it because actually, as you got close to the ground, it might cause you to go a bit high. But apart from that, it was absolutely wonderful. I used to teach my students how to land it by numbers. You could literally land it by numbers.
Oh, yeah. By the way, you mentioned the ground effect. I know if you're going for a British Airways selection at the moment of this recording, you may go, I don't know if they still do it in the 747 sim, but a friend of mine who did it in 2019 still had to go, and both of them had to go around. Although my friend actually was typewritten on the 777, because the ground effect was such that he destabilized his approach. So both of them did the same thing. They destabilized their approach at 200 feet, something like that,
200.
because of the ground effect. So be careful. Continue. The number one enemy you can have on an approach which was stable is you seeing the runway and instinctively pulling on the stick. That's something that many people do out of instinct, and this little degree or two will destabilize your approach. Or if you know that you're coming into the ground effect, basically your enemy is to pull, because if you flare too high, you're going to destabilize your approach. So you need to keep it on that path all the way to the end. And in his case, interestingly enough, for his selection, he decided to go around right away when he saw he'd stabilized the plane, and his colleague didn't. And so my friend, he got into BA, and the other didn't, because my friend had to prompt him to go around. So the other one tried to land it anyway. And in fact, the exercise at BA in those days ended upon that go around. And so it's not so important to land the plane actually during a selection. What's important is the quality of your decision making and the fact that you're not going to continue in an unstable situation. And so how was the 100 compared to the 400, you said? Was it similar?
Very similar. The difference between the 100 and the 200 was not dramatic, except in terms of extra range and weight. The handling characteristics were very, very similar. And I must say, the 400 was even better. I mean, we're talking about very small minutiae here, really, but all three aeroplanes handled very, very similarly and very nicely. I must say, it was a wonderful aeroplane to fly.
How much heavier was the 400 compared to the 100?
I know you knew you were going to ask me that. I know.
Yeah,
I can tell you
roughly.
I think if I remember rightly, the 100 max landing weight was around about 280. No, it couldn't have been nearly 300 tons.
Oh, right.
No, 285. Max landing weight for the 100 and the 200 was 285. And for the ERS extended range freighter, it was 310. So there's quite a big difference between them.
And takeoff weight for the 400?
Takeoff weight, and just again, I think it must have been about 350 tons. This is a big guess, but I know for sure that the ERS max takeoff weight was 412 tons.
Okay, so that's interesting, because if the 777, so the 777-300ER is 351 tons max takeoff weight. So compared to a 747, that's now 412 at its max configuration, right? At its heaviest configuration.
Yeah.
But then similar to the 747-100, and the 777 max landing weight, though, is much lower than all of that. It's 251, I think. It's much lower than both of these 747s, in fact. So you could land a 747 at 310 tons, which seems massive to me. It seems absolutely huge.
On the freighter, yes, not on the passenger.
Interesting. So in a 777, you've got 100 tons difference between your takeoff and your landing if you're taking off at max takeoff weight. And on the 747, it was even more than, it was like 120, something like that.
It could be, absolutely.
Could be. Wow. So this means for you, if you're not you've not approached these machines yet, or if you're not yet a pilot, maybe watching this, what this means is we take off, and on a 777 that was going to use almost all of its fuel during that flight, bar of course the final reserve and the alternate fuel, you would be allowed to land roughly 10 hours into the flight. So you had a 14-hour flight planned, and you would do 9 to 10 hours before you could actually at max landing weight.
Of course, we, as I assume the 777, we had a fuel dumping system that used to dump 2 tons a minute. So we could dump fuel and come down to max landing weight if necessary. But yes, that's true. The freighter, we could take off perhaps at 180 tons one day to position the aeroplane empty somewhere. And then the next day we could take off at 412 tons. So there's 200 tons difference.
Yeah, that's actually what caused me the one flight where I regret that I didn't adjust a procedure. And I think we discussed this together once, Calvin. It was a day where I was taking off on an empty freighter, because like you mentioned, I think on one of the episodes, when you do a freighter flight, one day you half of the sectors roughly are flown empty or almost empty. You go and get some freight and you bring the airplane back completely loaded. And on that day, there was wind shear forecast. And so there was wind shear forecast, and we were taxiing, and we had an empty freighter. And the procedure is that you should use toga when you take off under wind shear, except that the plane was maybe 180, 190 tons. And the stop altitude was 4,000 feet. And I elected to use the TOGA figures because that's all we'd computed during briefing. And I really struggled to handle the plane. We managed, but it was a real handful. And because it was so bumpy, I struggled to grab, the buttons on the FCU to do what I had to do in order to control the rate of climb. And it was probably the only time I was uncomfortable on the plane. And I discussed with instructor friends, and they said, how much protection did you have already just by taking off without TOGA? And just think about it. These things need to be briefed. And you could have had a better reflection on this. And you see, this is maybe 2.5 years after my upgrade. I learned something on that flight. I learned something important that unfortunately is not taught during training. And this is where my friend, my instructing friends had just a level above. He'd thought about this. He had a technique and a strategy for this. I didn't. So I just applied the procedure. And that day I learned a big lesson. So what was interesting is that, when you have wind shear, and that's going to be just a mini lesson on wind shear, my understanding of wind shear is that we're not supposed to take off in wind shear. But fortunately, at large airports, and please correct me if I say something that's incorrect, Calvin, because you're the instructor. But basically, luckily at large airports, you have airplanes that are going to try and land in these conditions. So they are arriving at the end of their flight and they're going to try and land. And if they encounter wind shear, they're going to go around. And then you know that there's wind shear in the area. But as soon as you see a couple of airplanes land and they've not reported wind shear, it means that the wind shear is basically just suspected, possible, but not evidenced just now, which means that you're going to actually go. And so in this case, as I was taxiing on that day, actually, there hadn't been any wind shear reports for 10 minutes. So I was perfectly in my right not to apply the TOGA takeoff. And by doing so, I actually took a risk of losing vertical control of the plane, basically. When we took off at 800 feet, I had, I think, 4,500 feet a minute. It was insane how much power this plane had, So it was just one of those things that doesn't happen on short haul. Because when you fly a short haul plane, the range of operation, the range of weights isn't like that. And actually, it only happens on the freighter, that it's this extreme, like you said. So I thought I would share this little story. I don't know if you have any feedback on what you think.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. Wind shear is a major problem. I used to operate into Hong Kong a lot. I'm sure you have too.
Yeah.
And of course, the new airport is basically to the side of Lantau Island. And if you have a wind from the southeast, the chances are you're going to get turbulence and rotors on landing. So I've never had a wind shear go around in my career, but I've had a lot of changes in big changes in airspeed on the approach. So I think with experience, you have to use your experience, your knowledge to deal with each individual situation yourself. And I like what you said there, because I would agree with you. If wind shear is forecast for takeoff, you're supposed to use TOGA, absolutely. If, however, it's up to you as a captain at the end of the day to decide whether or not you're going to go, but most of us would actually go out to the takeoff point and assess the situation at that particular point. And what you say is absolutely true. You're not just concentrating on what the Met or the tower is telling you. Listen to your fellow pilots, and that's very important as a pilot, that you report wind shear. You tell the tower, you tell everybody, I lost 20 knots on the approach, there was wind shear on the approach, something like that. So we all help each other, and that's a very important aspect that I try and get my students at my ATO to remember, help each other out.
Yeah, indeed. And that day, my instructor friend, he told me, this is why you're being paid. Yes, the safest thing of action on that day would have been to not follow the SOP. But this is why there's a human on the plane, and that's you. And you had to make that call. And he said that would have been the best call to make. Now, if you wanted to follow the SOP, you should have briefed a mitigation strategy in case you got the positive wind shear that you got, and how you were going to manage the knobs, how you're going to manage the modes. And not only you decide to take off with TOGA, two, you didn't brief this in advance enough. And so you got surprised. And I was like, oh my God, I learned my lesson today. We didn't burst any speed, no nothing. But, when you're in command of the plane, and as a first officer, it's the same. You want to feel that you've got rooms to spare when it comes to safety. You don't want to feel that you're, oh my God, this is just getting a real, handful that I didn't expect. You don't want to be in this situation. So anyway, I was a little wind shear and decision making and what it's like to be a captain. And like we said last time, the captain is supposed to take a safe course of action at all times, even if it means deviating from regulations and standard operating procedures. And let's remember, in my case, we were on the ground. Nobody forces you to take off when you're on the ground.
I would agree with you, Guillaume, but what you said there is most important, is the value of a good briefing.
Threat-based briefing.
Absolutely. And of course, you don't think you're going to get wind shear. What happens if you do? What are we going to do? What buttons are we going to press? Always be proactive, always be one step ahead. That's really important.
Exactly. And there's another thing that my friend told me. He said, you could have told ATC that you wanted an unrestricted climb because of a potential of a positive. And this would have helped so much, because what happened is, where it got difficult is because the airplane has such a massive rate of climb at 800 feet that it went to capture. For those of you who fly already, you'll know what that means. The airplane captured the 4,000 feet stop altitude at 800 feet. And that's very unsafe from an autopilot flight director point of view, which is why we had to get back to flying the plane manually. So yeah, it could have been, if you think ahead, and I think DA had this thing to say, notice, understand, think ahead.
Yes.
NUTA, right? Notice, understand, think ahead. So the idea would have been to think ahead. Okay, what can I do to prevent something from getting out of control? I can ask ATC that I want an unrestricted climb to 10,000 feet. This would have been thinking ahead, you see. All right, Calvin. So we said in this episode we would talk about the 747 again, about the different generations of 747, 747s and when they were introduced. So do you want to elaborate on this for us once again?
Yeah, Guillaume, I thought we might finish this particular episode by a brief discussion on when the aircraft were delivered. The very first 747-100 was delivered in April 1970. But at the time, there was industrial action amongst the pilots because the aeroplane was much bigger, and they felt that they should, understandably, in my view, be paid more for flying a much bigger aeroplane with longer flight days, flight time limitations, and all of these sort of things are taken into consideration. So British Airways, BOAC had received 3 747s. The first 3 already were delivered, but they sat on the ground idle for a year because the dispute took a year to settle. The thing about this was that the aeroplanes were costing BOAC £25,000 at the time per day, just sitting idle. So what they did was they leased the engines that were on those aeroplanes. The good old Pratt & Whitney JT9D 3A engines were very unreliable. In fact, I had quite a few engine failures myself when eventually I started flying them. And so BOAC leased out these engines to other aircraft, and they managed to cover a little bit of the loss by leasing out the engines. But I also remember very clearly, when I go to work, we used to have to report in the hangars at British Airways or BOAC. I can remember seeing the 747 with great chunks of concrete, big concrete blocks hanging where the engine should be, to stop the wings actually flexing because an engine on a 747 actually weighs around about 5 tons, and so the bending moment on the wings without them would have been unacceptable. Yeah, because the weight of the engine is designed to stop the stresses at the wing root, of course. So that's what they did, and eventually we had a total of 15 747-100s, which became British Airways in 1974, and the last one was delivered just before then in 1973. The first 200, which was a different wing and with Rolls-Royce RB211s, was delivered in June 1977. And then BA ordered 24 of the 200 series, and the very last one was delivered in 1988. And then eventually the queen of the skies of them all, the first 400 was delivered in 1989.
Excellent. And so in terms of technology, so I think we brushed on this a little bit at the beginning already, the 100 and 200 were of similar technology. The 74 was, of course, a big breakthrough. So do you want to talk about that again a little bit, just quickly?
Yes, the 100 and 200 were, as far as the pilots were concerned, were interchangeable. You could fly one day and 200 the next day. The instrumentation was exactly the same. The aeroplane, the 200, had a longer range, had a greater takeoff weight, if I remember rightly. It was just from a handling point of view exactly the same. We still had a flight engineer. We still had still had analog instruments on it. It was they were indistinguishable. And I think I mentioned when I went to the so-called beach fleet, that was before the 400, was around about the time the first 400 was delivered. So in the late 80s, we had a mixture, as I've mentioned, of 5 different 100, 200 series, no 400s, and they all in themselves had slightly different instruments. So you could fly any version of the 100 and 200, but you needed to do a complete conversion course to fly the 400. There was no flight engineer, 2 pilots, flat screen instruments. It was quite a different aeroplane.
And was there industrial action when the flight engineer was removed?
No, there wasn't. And what they did was they actually offered the younger flight engineers a chance to become pilots. And I can't remember the numbers, but I'm guessing maybe 20 did. And some of them eventually became captains on short haul.
Yeah, I flew with quite a few. When I was short haul at Beyond the 320, I flew with quite a few captains who told me that they were flight engineers, quite a few of them. So, of course, they had to go and sit their license. I don't know if they had to do the ATPL or whether that was covered as...
Yes, they did. They did. They had to go to an ATO. They had to go through the whole thing, and a few failed on the way. And they do exactly as the students we're talking to now would do. They had to go through the whole type technical. They had to do all of the theory and so on for the ATPL. They had to do everything.
Yeah, so what happened for some of them is that they learned to fly when they were not in their 20s, which is something that many of our viewers who are right now sitting cadet programs with no age restriction are actually doing now. They are becoming pilots when they're in their late 30s, 40s. Some people learn to fly in their 50s. So those flight engineers had to go through that, and they managed. But from what...
Yes, they actually had a great benefit of having spent 20 years in a flight deck and a flight deck environment with good situation awareness. And so they had a big advantage from that point of view.
Yes. So excellent. So that was very interesting. Well, thank you so much for all these insights, Calvin. I think we'll just wrap this episode now, and then we'll get on to the next. What did we say we were going to talk about on the next one?
I think we might be talking about base training initially, and maybe CRM, or maybe that's a separate one. It's a big subject, isn't it?
Yes, and we'll talk about the coffee cup, the famous coffee cup. That's in your book. Okay, excellent. Thank you, Calvin. So it was a pleasure to have you all on this episode again. I hope you enjoyed our insights, particularly Calvin's, and also a little bit of my insights. And as always, we're here to help you. If you've got an airline selection coming, just check out our website, online.airlineselectionprogram.com, and check out our flagship course, Advanced Interview Course, that's helped so many pilots be successful and be comfortable at their airline selection. And for now, it's all for me. I'll see you at the next episode.
This podcast was brought to you by Airline Selection Program, a company that is focused on helping you succeed at airline selections. Our flagship course, Advanced Interview Course, has helped hundreds of pilots just like you become successful. Visit our website at online.airlineselectionprogram.com and find out how you too can get the job of your dreams.